So the last couple videos that I have done have been here in Cerro Gordo, which is an old mining town, and the man who owns this town is with me today, Brent Underwood, and he has an amazing channel called Ghost Town Living, and he has an amazing book called Ghost Town Living, which I was actually listening to the audio version on the way up here. It just like totally got me in the mood. Yeah, so I figured that since I've been filming up here, I would have a chat with the man who is really bringing history back to life, and I'll be making a cocktail that might have been served at one of the saloons that they had here in town. So thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video as we hang out in an Old West ghost town, this time on Drinking History. So before we get started chatting, I think that we need to make our cocktail. So cocktails were sometimes served in saloons, even out here in the Old West. So I'm using a fairly simple cocktail recipe called a whiskey cocktail that comes from the 1862 How to Mix Drinks or the Bon Vivant's Companion by Jerry Thomas. Whiskey cocktail: 3 dashes of gum syrup, 2 dashes of bitters, Bogarts, 1 wine glass of whiskey, and a piece of lemon peel. Fill 1/3 full of fine ice, shake and strain into a fancy red wine glass. So the whiskeys that they had were pretty much everything that we have today, meaning, you know, bourbon, Scotch, Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, or just the stuff that they made out in the back. But I'm going to be using Jack Daniel's because they had that available at the time. I couldn't get Bogart's bitters. I ordered them, but they didn't arrive in time. So I'm going to be using Peychaud's bitters, which they also had. And then pretty much everything is the same. The gum syrup is basically just simple syrup with a bit of gum arabic, and it leaves a nice glossy finish on the cocktail. Cheers, Brent.
Cheers. Great having you up here.
Thank you. So glad to be here. Now, do you recognize these glasses?
I do, from the Gordon house.
Yes. So they used fancy red wine glasses, and these were red wine glasses at the time. Wine glasses were really small at the time.
Yeah.
So they had some from the period in one of the old houses, so I figured that's what we'd drink from.
That'll work. Great.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, it basically just tastes like whiskey, a little sweeter.
Sweet whiskey.
Pretty
like
simple. And it is like 9 o'clock in the morning, so don't feel compelled to finish the cocktail at this time. But what I thought was interesting was that a lot of saloons were open at 9 a.m.
Sure.
Because here in the ghost town, or when it wasn't a ghost town, when it was just a mining town, a lot of the miners were working 12-hour shifts around the clock, yeah?
All the time. I think that's interesting is that these days we come up here and we think it's so peaceful and beautiful, but like when the mine was active, it was anything but peaceful. It was almost very like hectic because to your point, 12-hour shifts, most of the establishments running 24 hours a day to service the people that are off shift. And so it must have just been insane up here. I mean, at its peak, I read that the town had close to 4,000 residents.
That's crazy.
And these days, if we get 50 people up here, it feels kind of busy.
It's crowded.
So to imagine 4,000 people is just, I don't know, it's cool, it's exciting, you know, it's something that just, I don't know, fires me up.
Yeah. Now, how many buildings, because right now there are what, a dozen buildings?
About, 15 buildings, I would say.
How many buildings were here in the heyday?
From my understanding, like hundreds of buildings were here,
Yeah.
Including a lot of tents, you know, that packed up and left with the miners whenever they would leave. But then the street that we're on right now is Main Street. So any of these flat spots that you see outside the window would have had buildings at them. There was another hotel and saloon right above this called the Cosmopolitan. That was actually one plot over from where we're sitting right now. So apparently that was a very fancy hotel and saloon. There was, of course, Lola's Palace of Pleasure, one of the brothels just above that. And so this was a very active route, you know, 150 years ago.
Now there's a picture in the room, I'm staying in the bunkhouse. There's a picture in my room of a woman who I believe might have been a brothel owner?
Lola Chow's probably, yeah.
Is that her?
She was quite the enterprising lady back in the 1860s. Yeah.
That's so crazy. Yeah, I'm like looking, I'm like, I recognize that lady from one of your videos.
Yeah.
That is so crazy.
She's a big entrepreneur. She had a brothel here at Cerro Gordo. She had a bar down in Lone Pine. She had a brothel in another mining town by here called Darwin. And one of my favorite stories about her is, I guess in Darwin, one of her customers got into an argument about the bill, right? So he was arguing about the bill. They went out into the street. She shot the man dead in the street, and the town never charged her or even tried her. So I think Lola Travis was not one to be messed with.
She
back
was
in the day.
powerful.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So you started your channel basically when I did. It was early 2020.
Yep.
And you had just bought the town. And why did you do that?
Yeah. So I actually bought the town 2 years prior in 2018.
Okay.
But I hadn't moved here full time until 2020. And it was just kind of a variety of things, I think. Growing up, my grandfather used to watch Gunsmoke on repeat, you know, that old
Oh, yeah,
Western show.
yeah.
And he had dementia, so like he would watch the same episode over and over and over. And I remember as a child, just like the allure of the American West was implanted pretty early. I think there's like definitely like a romanticism that's put upon the American West, whether it's like the old movies or this and that. I went to school for real estate. I just thought I wanted to become an architect, so I really enjoyed buildings. I ended up going to architecture school. Couldn't cut it. I just couldn't handle the software. Dropped out of that. Eventually started working in marketing, you know, kind of doing some online marketing with some different authors. But at the same time, I still had this passion for history and kind of hospitality. And so I had a bed and breakfast in Austin, Texas.
Oh, cool.
And that was in a Victorian mansion from the 1890s. And so I always love this idea of combining history and hospitality together. Because I think it's one thing to go to a city, but it's another thing to be able to stay in part of that city's history. You know, like you could go to any city and stay in a Marriott and it's going to be the same everywhere else.
Right.
Or you could, you know, stay in a building that's part of that history and just feel more alive. And so the thing in Austin was going very well. And then a buddy of mine knew that I was looking for a bigger project, something else to do. So we saw this come online. And I think the headline on boingboing.net or something was like, buy your whole town for under $1 million. And so he sent it to me, and he sent it to me in the middle of the night, like, hey, this might be up your alley. It's almost a joke. And then I remember waking up, and as we talked about last night, like, I love going down historic rabbit holes. So I started reading everything that I could about the town, and I was just like, oh my God, this is like Gunsmoke. This is the American West, you know, in real life.
Yeah.
And so I remember I called up the real estate broker and I said, hey, I'd like to buy your town. You know, thinking that I'd be like one of the first to want to do this. And I remember he just kind of laughed. He said, all right, well, get in line.
Really?
Apparently it was very popular already. So I went back to the drawing board. I researched it more. I sent him like my love of history, my understanding of the town, like kind of what I wanted to do with the town, which is preserve the historic nature, but allow more people to enjoy it. And eventually it worked out. And we closed on the property July 13th of 2018, which was Friday the 13th, which seemed very fitting, you know, for a ghost town to close on Friday the 13th.
Indeed.
And here we are.
And I love that you are, I mean, it's such an interesting mix here of preserving history. Like, what building are we in right now?
Yeah, we're in Blvd's general store. So the miners would have came in here during the day and bought their supplies. There's actually, you would love this actually, there's a piece of paper over there that's an inventory list for this exact store from 1918 that I got from the local museum. And it lists every single product that they held here.
I mean, I just love all of the knickknacks that might have been in this store, but also that you've just like found.
Yeah.
Just kind of hanging around. Yeah. But then there's also this, so there's the history aspect, but then there's also a bit of modernizing too. Yeah. I mean, you've got electricity, you got running water, you've got, I mean, and you wouldn't be able to do the YouTube channel without the internet, which you do have internet.
Yeah.
I noticed you have internet for yourself.
Yep.
And you have an open Wi-Fi, which is what I am on, which leads me into today's sponsor, NordVPN. See, even in a ghost town like this, when you are on public Wi-Fi, there are nefarious people out there who can try to get your sensitive information. And that is why on public Wi-Fi, you should always be on NordVPN. NordVPN encrypts all of your online activity, so even on public Wi-Fi, you can feel safe. Personally, I have also been using another Nord product called NordPass, which keeps all of your passwords safe in one spot because I keep forgetting them. And so if I want complicated passwords, NordPass keeps them and I can always access them. Also, if those passwords ever do find themselves in places they shouldn't be, like the dark web, then they will alert you so you can go ahead and change it. So visit my link at nordvpn.com/maxmiller and get a huge discount with the purchase of a 2-year plan plus 4 extra months. You can try it risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/maxmiller. So I didn't know that you owned a bed and breakfast.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
And so because I was going to say, do you know what you're getting into when you're building a hotel?
I mean, there's no playbook for bringing an abandoned mining town back to life. I think that's very much been learning on the job.
True.
I would like to think that I understand hospitality. I like in hosting people. I enjoy things like that. The hotel has just been its own beast because we are at the end of an 8-mile dirt road that you drove up. It's difficult to be here in an already very sparsely populated part of California.
Yeah.
And so because we're building from scratch, we're having to meet all modern building codes. And so contractors, as we've discussed, are difficult to come up here, difficult to keep going. But what I like a lot, and we talked about this a little bit, but at this point we've had, because of the channel, probably thousands of people that have come up and helped volunteer. And I think that each of them have helped with the hotel in some way, whether it's just moving concrete bags from one place to the other or nailing a nail in the wall. And what I like about that is that every person has their personal connection to the town. And I think that that's important to keep towns like this alive. I mean, there's not many towns in the American West left. A lot of these towns have just been destroyed or forgotten about in time. But I think at this point, so many people have such a deep connection to the town, in small part because of the channel, and then they kind of go about it themselves. And I think that in a time when often social media can be villainized for things that it does bad, the idea that YouTube is bringing an abandoned mining town back to life is very poetic and beautiful to me. And I think it's a very interesting snapshot. I wonder in, let's say, 100 years, the idea of YouTube will be interesting probably. I wonder what will, And so the idea that this social media channel helped give this a second wind, it's already has to be discussed in the history book of Cerro Gordo moving forward, this moment.
Absolutely.
And so it'll be very interesting to see where that progresses from here. But to answer your question, I have a lot of good help, I would say, as far as guiding, bringing the town back to life these days. I've been really fortunate to be able to talk to experts in tons of different fields about different things, even about the food now,
Yeah.
the history of the food, which has been really fun.
We found an oyster shell because they were eating oysters up here.
Crazy to think about.
I mean, I don't want to say we're in the middle of nowhere, but we're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and they were eating oysters.
The middle of nowhere desert too, which is very...
Desert, yeah. I mean, so these oysters were coming in on trains in ice cars, refrigerated cars, before refrigeration. So it was just ice cars.
Yeah.
And brought up here on mules, probably.
And that's so cool too that that piece of history, had I seen that shell myself, I would I would have ignored it. And as I have been, it's been sitting on the shelf over there probably for many months. But now somebody can provide the context to it. And I think that the context brings the town to life in even more ways. Now I'm imagining these miners eating oysters up here, which is a crazy thought in my mind.
Well, and that's what I love is everything here. It's just like, I mean, driving up that dirt road, it is like going back in time, like slowly until you can't see anything of the modern world really. And everything here has a story.
Yeah.
Whether it's the massive bellows on the wall or the old stove, or in your museum, you found a coin.
Yeah, we were trenching in a water line and a guy that's working up here named Trevor, he's like, Brent, come here. And we found a coin on the front and stamped Cerro Gordo Store, Keeler, California. On the back, it's 12.5 cents, which was a bit back in the day.
Right.
And so the idea that they had their own currency here was never in any of the history books. It had never been discussed. And so we were discovering history firsthand and adding to the history books, because it also changes the entire color of how I saw the town, because company currency was used in company towns, and company towns were very onerous and oppressive to the workers. They were basically ensuring that you're never going to make money, that you're going to stay here forever. And that just adds a different tinge to, the entire way I see the history here. Yeah. And each day, every little item from the coin to now the oyster and everything else, I feel pieces together the history of Cerro Gordo in a way that I don't think it's ever been pieced together before. And again, that's in part to, people coming up and helping out and just contributing their own insights into the past here.
Well, one thing you mentioned last night that I thought was really interesting, and how the YouTube channel has affected this place positively, is you said that there was a guy back in the 70s who ran the town, was the caretaker.
Wally Wilson.
And if you came up and gave him $5, you could take away a bucket of whatever.
Yeah.
So it kind of cleaned out a lot of the history. Yeah. But now that you have the YouTube channel, people are sending you those things back.
Yeah, people are sending them back, and they know that now that I think people understand that the town is in good care and that's going to be here for a long time. And so I've had people send back artifacts, but I've also had people send in, I mentioned this too, like their personal family journals of their family members who have worked here. And that's history that would have been just essentially lost to time. It would have sat in their own history. And then some of these families have allowed me to share their family stories and insert them into the like greater known history. So I feel like every day we're building up a more robust history of the town here, which is exciting. It just feels like a historic scavenger hunt where every day we're putting on another puzzle piece onto the puzzle, and it gets more clear each day that goes by.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of like what I like to do with my channel, except that I'm doing it from my desk. It's all online. It's all books. Yeah. You're getting to do it in person. It's like really bringing history back to life in person. I just, I'm a little jealous and a little like, oh boy, I don't think I could do that because I see how much you work and it's a lot. So, talking about a few more things that I found in the you showed me in the museum. I was looking at a box in there that says dynamite on it. And there are sticks of dynamite in that box, Brent.
The sticks are replications of something made
thank
for
goodness.
Us. But the box is real. So the mines here were made from dynamite, which, fun fact that your viewers might like, dynamite, invented dynamite?
Nobel.
Exactly. And so, and then from my understanding, at the end of his life, he looked at it very sadly to see what it eventually was used for. But the dynamite box also tell a story in themselves, because when dynamite came out, there was just one company making the dynamite. And eventually mining and the use of dynamite got so big in the West that it became under the antitrust laws. So they made them break up. And so they eventually split into Atlas, Hercules, and...
I think that's Hercules in there.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can kind of date when the last time somebody was in the mine based upon what dynamite boxes are in there.
Oh,
which
interesting.
I find really interesting. And so as I'm going through the dynamite down at Cerro Gordo, you can see that's one day's haul of dynamite boxes from down in the mine. There's just a ton down there. But I like that as I bring them up, I can kind of get a sense of when the last time somebody was walking around there was. But also, side note for people that might want to explore abandoned mines, old dynamite can be extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
It bleeds the nitroglycerin and it crystallizes. And so that's something that I was told early on. I'm very glad that I was told early on, because I see a lot of crystallized dynamite down in the mine. And I've actually asked the local bomb squad, essentially with the police, like, what should I do? And he said, well, basically you have 2 or 3 options. One is called blipping, which is blow in place. So you blow it up there, which I was like, well, no,
Because it's in the mine.
Yeah, I was like, no, I don't want to
cause a cave-in.
Yeah, I don't want to collapse my mine. 2, so dynamite needs actually impact to explode. It's not the.
Well, it's not a charge.
Exactly, yeah. It's at the very end of the fuse, there's a blasting cap that creates a small, then that makes it blow up.
Okay.
So you could throw dynamite into a fire and nothing's going to happen. It's just going to burn.
Really?
So you can actually soak dynamite in diesel and then burn it. That's another option to get rid of it. Huh. But then I started thinking, a bunch of carbon monoxide in the mine, probably.
Again, you don't want to do that down
yeah.
there. Yeah.
And then he's like, third option is just leave it alone. I was like, all right, that seems like the easiest option. So I just
don't fall on it, I guess.
Yeah, I just leave the dynamite alone. But yeah, there's a lot down there. Even all those doors that almost look like movie props that say danger.
Yeah.
Those are out of the mine.
Another really interesting thing in there was all the stuff from Chinatown.
Yeah.
So Cerro Gordo had a Chinatown.
It did, yeah, just over the hill here. And I think that actually the miners are predominantly Chinese. Like the majority of the miners were Chinese. But
Really?
again, this was 1865. The Civil War, was just ending. And so there was still a lot of segregation. And so Chinatown was just over the hill here. And from my understanding, they had kind of their own community over there, their own restaurants. The cabins are constructed a little bit differently. Over here, there's a lot of tents and wooden cabins. Over there, there's a lot of stone cabins. And it's funny that
Interesting.
a lot of those are still standing.
Yeah.
And a lot of these are still just gone. And we found everything from Chinese tea tins to even older Chinese coins that, from my understanding, would be hung up for good luck inside of the cabin, to opium bottles, to everything else
Wow.
that was here. And it's really wild.
That's crazy. And I'm guessing a lot of those people, because I was reading, I don't know about here, but the Chinatown in the 1850s in San Francisco was like 98% male.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing it was the same here.
Yeah.
You know, it was, they had left their families, and just crazy.
And I think probably, so a lot of, from my understanding, a lot of Chinese immigrants came for a variety of reasons, but including the gold rush. But imagine by the time that people got here, I heard stories that people would hear about the gold rush in Europe and come here to be here. But by the time they got here, it had
over.
ended by years earlier even.
Yeah.
And so the silver boom was kind of after that. And so a lot of them started making their way this way to go either to the Comstock lode or elsewhere. And so I imagine a lot of the Chinese workers that were here might have been part of the early gold rush around San Francisco, and then 10 years later made their way out here, where they lived. It's difficult though, because there are some census studies from Cerro Gordo back in the day, but the Chinese were notoriously underrepresented. They just didn't even include them in the census sometimes. And so it was always, it's difficult to pin down that piece of the history, but we've been trying to do our best. And one thing that we discovered that is evident in a lot of mining towns is that the Chinatown actually had its own cemetery as well, where the main town cemetery is up here. Chinatown's is in a different portion of the area too, which again just kind of speaks to the times, I guess, of when it was.
When we often forget about, like you said, the majority of miners were, as reading something about, you know, there was the Chinese Exclusionary Act, of course, where they couldn't immigrate anymore. But there were also in small towns Chinese exclusionary hours, where they weren't allowed in the town outside of certain hours.
Yeah.
And so they were often the cooks in saloons and restaurants and people's houses.
Yeah.
But then they were kicked out of town come nightfall. So they couldn't live in town.
That's interesting. The building behind Belshaw's house right there, the little cabin, was his cook's house, and his cook was Chinese. And so outside of that cabin, we found a number of Chinese artifacts when we were digging around for water lines over there too.
Interesting.
But yeah, it was a different era. I think the incident here that illustrates, I think, the times related to that, the race relations, to me, it was like, there was a mining collapse here in 1871 at the 200 level, and 30 miners were trapped underneath rock. They basically did what's called overstoping. So they took out too much of the ceiling, and the ceiling fell in on them, and so much of the ceiling fell in on them that they couldn't get them out. And they've never gotten them out. They're actually still there. And they were all Chinese miners, but they didn't even know, like, essentially who they were. And so they were never able to, like, relay the information from my understanding. And so, yeah, it's kind of the dark side of, again, the romanticization of the American West as well.
Yeah, you know, you watch shows like Gunsmoke.
Yeah.
Or even later Westerns from, you know, much later, Tombstone and Deadwood and everything. Well, I think Deadwood dealt a little bit with it, but everybody's white.
Yeah, totally.
And that's not how the American West was at all, especially here. I'm guessing there were a lot of Mexicans because it was Mexico until 1848.
Yeah, and the prospectors who were credited with establishing the town were Pablo Flores, who Mexican prospector, and so I would say, like, the demographic of the town back in the day probably was like almost majority not white.
Yeah.
We had a lot of Mexican miners, a lot of Chinese miners, a variety of different people, and so I think it's interesting to think about that too as I think back to the history here.
As I always say, history is not always written by the victors, it's written by the people who write stuff down.
Yes.
And you look at the newspapers, you look at the census and all that stuff, and who is represented isn't necessarily the majority. They were the ones in power.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
watch Ghost Town Living, the channel. It's wonderful. You document really your entire time up here. Yeah. But also this book, it's really fantastic. You go into so much personal detail about what inspired you, and you know, like I said, you're bringing history you're preserving history, but you're also bringing it back to life. Stuff that was for lack of a better word, dead. It was a ghost town.
Sure.
And I think that's amazing. And I think my audience would think that's amazing. So Ghost Town Living, check out the channel, check out the book. And thank you so much for letting me film up here.
Of course. Thank you for having me. Thanks for coming out.
And I'll be back once the hotel is open.
Anytime.
Awesome. Cheers. See ya.